Hi, I'm Chris. I'm one of the founders of LIS, and I'm here with Amelia to talk about something called positional good, which I'm about to learn quite a lot about.
I'm Amelia Peterson. I'm head of learning and teaching here and also part of the faculty.
I was reading the other day about something called positional good.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not an economist, but what is that actually?
So yeah, positional goods is an interesting concept because it's sort of used in economics, but also comes out of sociology and even in political science, people thinking differently about like what are the kinds of things we have in society, how is value created.
Can you give an example?
Typically we think about kind of public goods and private goods. So that's the difference between something that is owned and just kind of has utility or value for an individual, that's a private good, versus a public good, something that has utility or value more generally for the public. So we might think of the difference between something you buy, the clothes you have that are good for you, versus something that kind of creates wider benefits. So education, there's often a debate about, is education a private good? Like when I study at a university, am I just deriving benefits for myself? Or is it a public good? Because when I become more educated, that also maybe creates benefits for the wider society. The theory of positional goods comes in there and says, well, there's also this type where the value of it depends on the other people that have it. So we might think about something like designer goods. Who else owns that good has some impact on how they're perceived and therefore on the value that you derive as an individual. If I go out on the street wearing a kind of paper bag, some people might think I look silly. If I go out as an influencer wearing a paper bag, it might suddenly become this sort of product that is desirable for other people. It kind of means something. In the same way, if we think of a degree from a particular institution, maybe, whether it has a particular benefit to the individual, some might argue depends on, well, who are the holders of that degree? So again, this is just an argument, but we could say that the value of a certain degree derives from, well, who holds it, and therefore what does it signal in a market? Now, as you can imagine, this is kind of a controversial theory because, we might want to think of degrees more as only public goods. We might want to think of them only more as private goods. But if we believe at all that this theory of positional goods has any meaning, then we have to kind of think carefully, who are the holders of our degrees? And therefore, what is that signaling in the wider market?
So, in a sort of simplest form to understand, a positional good could be like a really expensive car, right?
Sure.
And I'm associated with being special because I have this really expensive car, and others can't have that expensive car, so therefore.
Sure. So the theory of positional goods, it usually applies that something has more value because of its scarcity.
Yeah.
So, and that's typically derived from that there aren't many of them available. So companies that only make kind of high-end luxury items, they're not looking to make them at scale to make vast numbers of them. They're looking to make smaller numbers to maintain the scarcity of them. And so they're seen as a rarity and they have higher value attached to them.
So that's the example where sort of money is the wedge in between those that can and cannot.
The bottleneck.
The bottleneck.
Exactly.
So how would you then, if you take the public good and thinking about the degree, how would you resonate that? How does that work?
So we might be concerned that some institutions might keep a bottleneck on the number of people that can hold their degrees in order to maintain their scarcity value, in order to maintain their kind of positional value. So if we think of universities that exist around the world, we might wonder, well, why haven't they expanded in size if they're so in demand? Because there are obviously many, many people who want to access that kind of education, but they haven't necessarily expanded in size. So that might lead us to question, well, why not? Is that because they're trying to keep some kind of artificial bottleneck on what they offer?
Yeah.
And for us, obviously, an institution, we would want to be able to expand and offer our education to as many people as want it, to as many people as we can provide it to as we grow. And so we would hope, perhaps, that it wouldn't only have value as some kind of positional good, that it would have value as more of a public good.
It's interesting then how you think, perhaps it used to be that you take the university sector, the school sector, which was heavily constrained by people physical meetings and physical conversations, initially the constraint was that. And then over time, perhaps the sort of value and positional good in that took over and said, well, let's not have too many. So in that sense, the internet doesn't stop anyone to make their positional good available to everyone. And then that's a really interesting...
So the internet arguably removes the question of physical space as the limiting factor on how many people one can provide an education to. There is, of course, still the question of time and people. You need people who can teach. You need the time to teach people in. But it certainly does remove one potential limiting factor on how many people one can educate at once.
It's interesting. Yeah, of course. But one idea or one thought I have is when you think positional good, you think money as a limiting factor. If you think from an education point of view, there is the scarcity of thought. And some type of education may trigger certain thoughts and certain behavior and certain mindsets, but it's not as easily accessible to everyone.
Sure.
From a motivational point of view or access point of view, or maybe not having the money to do it.
So here we get into our beliefs about capability for learning. And again, we would perhaps hope that there are many, many more people in the world who are capable and eager to learn than are currently being provided for by our existing education systems. And so that, I guess, is a bet of places like LAS that we're optimistic about the capability and the motivation for learning, and the fact that not as many people perhaps do so and are completing university degrees as might do. I guess we would say is, well, that's due to the infrastructure available than it is to people's motivation and willingness to learn.
Perhaps it's also due to like reputation, sort of media coverage, in the sense that there may be vested interest to not change current ways.
So this brings us into another potential way of thinking about what a degree or a university education is to think about it in relation to the concept of an opaque good. So the idea of opaque goods comes from a French sociologist called Opaque, who proposed that, well, actually lots of things, their value isn't exactly clear externally, and their value is only assigned by what he describes as judgment devices. So the example he uses most is pieces of art. Like the value of any given piece of art isn't necessarily clearly determined by the market, by exchange in a market, because each piece of art is unique. And so the value of it is assigned instead by processes like critics, art fairs, people who are using kind of expert judgment to determine value. And likewise, thinking of a university education or a degree, we could say one of the problems is that the value of it is somewhat opaque, because all of the processes that go in, the skills that someone gets out of it, one can't necessarily see from the outside. You don't know until you've been through it exactly what you're going to get from it. And even when you come out the other side, it's not necessarily visible to the wider public, to employers, what you can now do. And this is where we get into some of the current limitations, I think, in the assessment systems, particularly at the university level, that we're not necessarily that good at demonstrating, but what is it that somebody can do when they come out of a degree. And it's why LAS was so interested in things like getting students to do kind of real pieces of work, real projects, which are ways for us to try and say, look, this is what our students can actually do, rather than having them kind of take some test where they get a number out the end and no one really knows exactly what that number means in relation to all the other numbers that people get at other places.
No. So do you think that, so a university degree could be an opaque good, but in a sense that limiting the access or making it more valuable, would that have an advantage for a challenger type of brand, type university like LIS? could there be an advantage to be limiting it initially, limit the sort of access to it, so that it then can grow a lot faster and reach many more people in the long term?
I think the key is that when something is small,
kind of, I think it's almost like marketing, branding, thinking.
Sure, but I think when something is small, one has the benefit of really trying to ensure quality. So I think in that stage of being small, one's really trying to ensure quality, so that when the opacity, when the opaqueness is removed, you know, what stands beneath it is really of quality. Otherwise, there is the risk that things are kind of created that are all like just about brand, and actually there's nothing underneath it. So in that sense, you know, being small, it's not just about making something scarce for the sake of it, but it's about really trying to ensure quality.
It's a bit like, got to let the tree grow the trunk a fair amount before the branches start to go out, otherwise they fall off.
It's got to have
It's a
real
fantastic
foundations.
analogy. It's like unbelievably good. So Amelia, at LAS we're very focused on quality and applied learning, so that people can use what they learn when they come out in the big wide world. How does that link to the positional good conversation we've just had?
Sure, yeah. Well, positional goods, because they're often linked to ideas of kind of luxury or of high value, you know, they might help us think about, well, how does one demonstrate that something is really valuable? But they can ultimately be a little bit of kind of misdirection, because it's all very well when you have a kind of luxury product to think, oh, you invest a lot in creating something really beautiful, a beautiful car, a beautiful handbag. But ultimately, education isn't like that. It's an experience. And for each person coming through it, you're creating it afresh every time. And so one has to invest a lot in doing that to ensure that the quality is there for each person coming through. So that's why I think ultimately, you know, we want to think of education as something that is both a private good, it's a benefit for that person, and also a public good, that our students will go out into the world and create value out there. And so it's not the same as thinking about a luxury product. It's really thinking about the experience and what you're investing in each person who's coming through.